The railway troops have been involved in nearly all of the most important events in Soviet history. They were vital in World War II. They were essential in the reconstruction that followed. They played a key role in linking the USSR with its new post-war allies. They were present in Afghanistan and partook in the Chernobyl liquidation. And this is just a short list of their many efforts. But by far their most impressive contribution as far as civil affairs are concerned was their assistance in realizing the construction project of the century, the Baikal-Amur main line.
Ever hear of a Gandhi dancer? Well, he's the fellow that laid the railroad tracks. He pushed those steel ribbons clear across this great land. He worked hard, and it was a lonesome life. Across the prairie, marking a course, laying a road for the iron horse, with the blazing sun on my breaking back, a long, long way to the end of track. Swinging ahead of the engine bell, the hot air filled with the black smoke smell, and time with the big crew breaking the ground, and the big boss yelling, keep laying them down. Pal, it's not the sun I mind, or the weight of the railroad ties. It's the gal that I left behind. Keep seeing those eyes, keep seeing those eyes. Got no time for thinking now, keeping this pace with the sweat on my brow, racing the puff of the old smokestack, a long, long way to the end of track. End of track and I needed rest, might ease this aching out of my chest, so lift that hammer to your back and feel and show how a good man drives that steel. It's not the sun I mind, or the weight of the railroad ties. It's the gal that I left behind. Keep seeing those eyes, keep seeing those eyes. Pistols squealing, sledges pound, laying them down on the hard rock ground. If you want your pay, keep breaking your back. It's a long, long way to the end of track. Creeping along a tide of time, we'll get our rest at the end of the line. I'll drive my body till it falls apart and work that woman right out of my heart. Pal, it's not the sun I mind, or the weight of the railroad ties. It's the gal that I left behind. Keep seeing those eyes. Keep seeing those eyes.
Following the conclusion of the Second World War, a great reconstruction was engaged across the USSR. It was the first 5-year plan of the post-war period that called for a revitalization of the Soviet Union. This was approved in March of 1946, and would conclude in 1950. This directive put great emphasis on industry, agriculture, and to ensure these goods could function as well as be delivered, railways. 40 billion rubles, or 16% of the nation's economy, was allocated to the improvement and establishment of new and existing rail transport. To ensure the expediency of this task, the railway troops were assigned to assist in the restoration of the country's transport capabilities. The role of the railway troops remained relatively consistent throughout the existence of the branch. While the means in which they conducted these actions would change radically alongside their organization, their primary purpose was always construction, bridging, repair, and maintenance. At the end of World War II, 37 separate railway brigades and 34 railway regiments had been created. This amounted to a total manpower of 291,000. With peacetime came radical organizational changes to suit the needs of the country. As a result, on the 23rd of June 1945, mass demobilization was engaged. This trend was mirrored across the entirety of the armed forces. Half of the railway troops' separate brigades were disbanded, and all regiments were dissolved. Manpower fell to around 189,000 men. The units that were spared were reorganized to a reduced peacetime staff. The reorganization of the railway troops began in late 1945, and was completed in 1946. Unlike other branches at the time, leadership reorganization was not engaged at the same scale. The main Directorate of Military Restoration was created as a part of the People's Commissariat of Railways on February 22, 1946, and was headed by the Chief of the Railway Troops. It received the abbreviation GUVVR. The GUVVR and the four corps created in 1946 that made up the organization remained until April of 1950. Separate railway corps were created in their place. The corps created as a part of the GUVVR were located in Kharkov, Kyiv, Smolensk, and Sverdlovsk. Later in 1947, due to productivity exceeding previously established expectations, the 3rd Railway Corps stationed in Smolensk was disbanded. Railway corps received the abbreviation ZHDK and were subordinate to the GUZHV, or Main Directorate of the Railway Troops. While the restoration of Soviet rail transport was successfully completed in a surprisingly short period of time, this did not mean issues were absent. The first problem encountered was the ability for the railway troops to construct civilian railways. During the war, simple, unrobust construction was considered acceptable. But for infrastructure meant to last under peacetime conditions, this was not the case. Alongside these concerns, the railway troops were tasked with assisting in the construction of depots, servicing facilities, warehouses, loading platforms, stations, residential buildings, schools, hospitals, and other structures they were not expected to maintain in wartime. As a result, there was a profound lack of experience in these matters. Training was organized with great haste to resolve this deficiency, while officers worked to develop a framework for its application. After this brief intermission, timber processing plants, stone and gravel quarries, and other facilities for the collection of raw materials to aid reconstruction were created to support the railway troops. 4 repair plants for equipment and mechanized systems were also established. These auxiliary organizations moved literal mountains of material to keep the GUVVR's 4 corps supplied. They produced 5 million cubic meters of commercial timber, 186,000 cubic meters of concrete, 1.5 million ties, 4,500 sets of switch beams, about 40 million blocks of brick, 336,000 square meters of residential housing, and 150,000 meters of other prefabricated structures. These efforts reduced the impact of material shortages on the railway troops significantly. Personnel worked to save resources wherever they could, but even then the primary issue for these production facilities was locating raw materials, which were quickly being consumed by similar organizations in other branches. The GUVVR was primarily focused on regions that had been under German occupation, as they had suffered the most. Special emphasis was placed on routes of strategic importance that were destroyed during the war, such as lines connecting Moscow to the Donbass, Caucasus, Lviv, Brest, Königsberg, Riga, and Leningrad. 1/3 of the work engaged by the railway troops transpired in Donbass. Significant effort was also aimed at improving rail transport to the Urals and Siberia, which was especially weak. These 4 corps were instrumental in allowing the USSR to rebuild after the war, as without their contributions it would have been impossible to move material throughout the Soviet Union to other critical industries. In February to March of 1949, work was underway on a 162-kilometer railway from Kyzyl to Perm. The Kyzyl-Perm line was commissioned to strengthen ties between the Kyzyl and Solikamsk-Usoli industrial facilities and the Perm railway junction. This was considered the most expedient means of getting coal from the Kyzyl basin and material from the Solikamsk-Usoli industrial region to other parts of the country. This route would be constructed by the experimental 5th Railway Corps, formed from the 37th Brigade, the 39th Brigade, the recently formed 34th Brigade, and the 35th Brigade. The 17th Bridge Regiment was also integrated into the formation. It was staffed by newer leadership with the intention of improving command. Simultaneously, work began on the Soyarvi-Lenduri railway line, which was to have a length of 208 kilometers, and later the Suka-Zero-Yushka-Zero line, which was 189 kilometers in length. These two routes combined to form the West Kurelayan Main Line. This main line was of great importance as it provided convenient access to forests in the Kurelayan ASSR. 200 million cubic meters of high-quality timber could be extracted if this route was opened up, which would amount to 37% of all timber produced in the Republic. Until 1950, railway reconstruction in the northwestern USSR was managed by UUVR-2. This reconstruction group was eventually dissolved and became the 6th Railway Corps. The corps included the 8th and 10th Separate Railway Brigades, the 4th Separate Bridge Regiment, and other specialized formations. That same year, the railway troops were tasked with the construction of a new 186-kilometer line, known as the Ust-Kamenogorsk-Ziranovsk Line. The 7th Railway Corps, which had been formed at the end of 1949 in Minsk, was redeployed to construct the line. The corps consisted of the 17th, 30th, and 36th Separate Railway Brigades and the 31st Separate Bridge Regiment. This line was commissioned to exploit the rich mineral deposits present in the Rudny Altai region. This allowed for lead and zinc industries to be established in eastern Kazakhstan. This line was completed in March of 1952. The railway troops were also tasked with assisting in the revitalization of Soviet agriculture. New broad gauge and narrow gauge lines would be required in regions where food had yet to be grown. Lines leading to previously farmed soil abandoned as a result of the war would also need to be restored. In 1953, a small portion of the railway troops were moved to the construction of new communication lines, tractor stations, grain warehouses, access tracks to grain receiving points, and other facilities for the newly organized state farms. The 5th Railway Corps, having completed the Kizil-Perm line and other facilities in the area of the Kama hydroelectric station, were deployed to Kazakhstan to assist in these endeavors. From 1953 to 1965, a total of 1,720 kilometers of new railway lines were built by the railway troops to support agricultural initiatives. With each passing year, as the railway troops accumulated peacetime experience, the volume of work they could engage increased exponentially. In 1956, for example, productivity rose by 86% when compared to 1948. In 1957, due to the deconventionalization of the military, the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 9th Railway Corps and all bridge regiments were disbanded. The strength of the railway troops was reduced by a factor of 2.4. This also significantly decreased the volume of work they could engage. Despite this, in 1959, the railway troops ceased the production of short 200 to 100 kilometer lines and shifted to the construction of routes reaching 400 kilometers in length. The most notable projects completed during this period are shown on screen. Despite the cuts, with the introduction of new, more modern equipment, high training standards, and the creation of new specialized jobs within each unit, by 1967 the volume of work completed by the railway troops had once again increased by 86% compared to 1957, and was 180% of all work engaged in 1956.
Около года назад я был на БАМе, встретил там много хороших людей и обещал написать о них песню. Я выполнил обещание. И я уверен, что еще встречу своих друзей, мы обнимемся и вместе споем эту песню. Спасибо за дружбу. Будьте спокойны, смелы, горды и счастливы. Я всех вас очень люблю.
Deep through the dagger, 60 below. Cut down the timber, fight through the sun. Айган с комарами, конечно, не Крым, но счастливы мы, тем не менее. Даешь, Комсомольск, мы опять говорим, как наших отцов поколение. Нужна наша молодость, нужны наши мускулы, чтоб рельсами врезалась.
солнце в небе светит мудро, молодеет древний край. От Байкала до Амура мы проложим магистраль. Встретим зябкие рассветы, встретим долгую пургу, биографию планеты пишем мы свою строку. Слышишь, время гудит, он на просторах крутых, он.
The BAM was both a military and civilian affair. This is an accurate description for why it was proposed, and of those who realized that concept. The BAM would allow for the civilian sector to grow, as agricultural prospects and rich mineral deposits would become accessible. It would also prompt population growth and the construction of new cities in the locations the aforementioned items were exploited. Equally as important, it would provide an extremely convenient route to move a large volume of military equipment deep within the country to improve early warning, air defense, and anti-missile defense. Additionally, it could offer advantageous locations to place elements of the strategic rocket forces. A relevant quote reads as follows: "The truth is that for the Soviet people, Siberia for decades has embodied a frontier. It was precisely here that Soviet man challenged nature, and his hopes are becoming increasingly real, overtaking the dreams of those who were the first to see, in these gigantic expanses, enormous opportunities. Siberia can rightfully be called the greatest treasure trove in the world. Its vast territories contain most of the mineral resources that are important for the modern economy. They harbor astonishing natural riches. The development of these riches and the use of inexhaustible energy resources determine the very essence of that intense tone in which one speaks when talking about man's challenge to nature." The BAM was first proposed by Stalin, well before the period this video focuses on. This was a result of the Japanese invasion of Manchuria, which destroyed the value of the Chinese Eastern Railway. The need for a railway far enough from the border to operate safely in wartime was becoming clear. Of course, the economic reasons discussed above were also considered at this time, but this was not its primary purpose. The issues associated with the decision to use prisoners for its construction will be discussed later. But for now, it is sufficient to state that this version of the BAM would be abandoned after Stalin's death. This was because it proved impossible to continue following the liquidation of the Gulag. Renewed interest in the BAM followed the discovery of enormous mineral deposits in the 1960s. These included some of the largest iron ore deposits in the world, alongside huge concentrations of coal, nickel, copper, mica, and tin. The region was also rich in natural gas and oil. In July of 1974, the Central Committee of the CPSU and the Council of Ministers of the USSR issued Resolution No. 561, which called for the construction of the BAM, or the Байкало-Амурская main line. This was a very exciting prospect within the USSR. Those who were alive at the time recall eagerly studying maps to imagine what a line connecting Baikal and Amur might look like. This was of course a daunting task. It was for good reason that it was described as the construction of the century. The distance was vast, but that was not the only problem. In fact, it was the least concerning element of the affair. Instead, it was the fact that much of the route passed through mountainous terrain with frequent earthquakes. A multitude of treacherous rivers would have to be crossed, which are shown on screen. The northern regions of the route were known for -50 to 60 degree frost that made the ground nearly impenetrable, which gave way to vast seas of mud in the summer. Lastly, there was not an ounce of infrastructure present throughout much of the route. No roads or even foot trails existed. While small settlements had been established, they were few and far between, largely sticking to riverbanks and other accessible areas. An unreasonable number of bridges, tunnels, viaducts, and culverts would need to be constructed to support the operation, and 3,145 kilometers of track would need to be laid, which amounted to an estimated 3,200 structures and more than 300 million cubic meters of earthworks. alongside a combined 27 kilometers of tunnels through the various mountains impeding the operation. The railway troops were tasked with building the eastern section of the BAM, which stretched from Tinda to Komsomolsk-on-Amur. Several formations would be deployed to begin work on the project. This was easier said than done, as they not only needed technical documentation for the route, but also reconnaissance of expected obstacles, a steady flow of building materials, easy access to food, and most difficult of all, semi-permanent housing to accommodate these units as they worked. The Ministry of Transport Construction was expected to handle re-equipping these units with the machinery required for an operation of this scale. Because there were not enough specialists within the railway troops to operate this equipment, the railway troops were authorized by the Ministry of Defense to recruit a contingent of qualified civilians to serve as instructors and operators. These volunteers would also be needed to fill the many auxiliary positions required to keep the railway troops supplied. After the assistance of the railway troops was requested, the first order of business was to plan and conduct route reconnaissance. A construction schedule would also need to be established, with approval from the chief of the railway troops. Simultaneously, engineers from across the USSR worked to weatherproof much of the equipment the railway troops had received, so that they could survive the brutal temperatures. Eventually, it was concluded that 8 reinforced railway brigades and 2 bridge regiments would be required. Each brigade consisted of 12 to 22 separate battalions and their material support units. These formations varied in size depending on the complexity of the tasks they were assigned and would be disbanded and reorganized according to need. The route was surveyed using helicopters and all-terrain vehicles like the GTT, which would become particularly well known on the BAM. A short section of the route had to be surveyed on foot, due to the dense tree cover. Foot reconnaissance patrols returned half dead. The following quote provides an apt description. "For 7 days we fought our way from Ziesk to Frvolsk. There are practically no roads. Cutting clearings will be difficult as many trees have fallen. Vast areas of the taiga are covered with marshland." Another quote reads much the same. A. Sharakov's group set out in mid-July and returned in September when night frosts were already nipping the grass. They went through quite a lot over that march, sleeping by the fire, catching fish in taiga rivers, bathing in ice-cold pools. The nights were already chilly, and before going to sleep, they would build a large fire. Then put it out, lay branches on top, spread their rain capes, and on them their sleeping bags. That's what seasoned taiga men do. In some cases, they would discover unmarked structures from prior construction efforts. These were rarely spotted by airborne reconnaissance, as tree cover was too dense. Units traveling from Moscow upon arriving in Komsomolsk-on-Amur used sections of the old BAM still partially maintained in this region by the Forest Ministry for logging purposes to reach the line of departure. This section covered 205 kilometers, which took 15 hours to traverse. Anatoly Ivanov described the line as follows. The cars were of pre-war construction, lit by kerosene lanterns. During the journey, there were 3 derailments. The main passengers were vagrants and fishermen. When boarding the only reserved seat, the conductor warned, "Comrade officers, guard the contents of your pockets and belongings. Organize watches." Thus began my first acquaintance with the BAM. Then we moved to Irgal, where the units of the future 37th Railway Brigade were arriving from Volgograd, Omsk, Vologda, Krasnoyarsk, Estonia, and Ukraine. The station was poorly developed, yet it was necessary to unload 2 to 3 echelons per day. They could not keep up with removing property and materials, although they worked around the clock. Many materials lay like a layered cake and belonged to different units. Families were forbidden to be taken along, but almost everyone brought wives and children. They were accommodated in tents and trailers. An agreement was reached with local authorities on allocating a wooden house of culture built in Chegdamin for the headquarters of the 1st Railway Corps, arranging schooling for children and transportation to the school. Experience gained on the Abukan-Taishit route and Ivdel to Ob line informed much of this preemptive decision-making. It was believed that the most efficient approach would be deploying across a wide frontage, after which simultaneous advancement from east and west would be carried out into the taiga.
Москва, апрель 1974 года. 17-й съезд комсомолов.
товарищ генеральный секретарь Центрального комитета Коммунистической партии Советского Союза. Мы, посланцы комсомольских организаций Москвы, Ленинграда, всех союзных республик, выполнить важнейшие поручения партии готовы, отдать все силы, знания, жар комсомольских сердец делу коммунистической партии, строительству коммунизма. Клянемся, 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 клянемся.
Tindouf and Urgel would be transformed into forward operating bases for the units. The construction line, or line of labor as it was known, stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The specific job of each subunit was established at assemblies and seminars held by formation commanders and political officers. Here, slogans such as "Give us BAM," "Work on the BAM," "In the spirit of the Komsomol," and "We will justify the people's trust" were adopted to motivate the troops and volunteers. Interestingly, many veterans of the Second World War who served in the railway troops lent their services in pursuit of the BAM's construction. One such individual was retired Major Kondrutyev, who, upon turning 60, signed up with his wife to assist in the project. When interviewed, he said, "When I learned about the BAM, I lost my peace of mind. Now I am happy that together with the young people I am building the main line of the century. The BAM is my second youth." The plan to deploy troops into the region was titled the Six-Ray Scheme. 8 reinforced railway brigades and 2 bridge regiments would make up the initial Taiga landing parties, as they were known. These units were augmented by 2 helicopter detachments. Alongside helicopters, at the outset of construction, 3 AN-26s were obtained to deliver personnel and their belongings. The application of fixed-wing aircraft was difficult. As the Nizhneongarsk airport, put into operation February 27th of 1953, was neglected, to say the least, and not up to modern standards. This airfield was originally employed for sporadic Yak-12 flights. The airport was also used as a means to ferry medicine, doctors, and patients to those who had begun to settle along the old BAM. This was primarily done with 2-passenger, single-pilot planes, such as the Li-2 and PO-2, already present from the 1939 survey detachment based out of Irkutsk. I will return to this subject shortly. The Taiga landing parties began work in autumn of 1974. Work was steady but difficult. Large rock formations had to be broken up and swamps had to be prepared for construction. This was done to prepare the area for the erection of various facilities that would allow the railway troops to live somewhat comfortably, as many brought their families with them. As winter set in, the construction of roads became a brutal, slow crawl. Despite this, work continued, as the spring would bring mud which would be worse than permafrost. The highways, which had been constructed 20 years earlier, had been reclaimed by nature, and were reduced to narrow paths, usually along sheer cliffs and steep hills. Shockingly, despite the constant flow of vehicles along these avenues, there was not a single accident as far as military vehicles were concerned. Though Ivanov recalls seeing 3 civilian vehicles along the northern supply route upside down in the trees below the hills. One detachment had to traverse more than 40 kilometers through terrain no human had ever set foot on prior to their arrival. Motorized and mechanized systems were difficult to move, but not impossible. Their pace was set by the less mobile assets such as shelters, sawmills, tools, and food. For 4 grueling days, soldiers pushed through the taiga. All seemed to be going according to plan until a radio transmission was received at the unit's headquarters. "We are at the 38th kilometer. The tractors are barefoot. The trucks are bogged down in the mire. We are pushing ahead on foot." Somehow, the detachment managed to reach the regrouping point with much of its equipment still intact. Shortly after this message, a second and then third arrived, all with the same complication as the last. These men endured every conceivable hardship in pursuit of just reaching the area in which they were to begin construction. In many cases, soldiers fell through the ground into freezing pools of water or had their shelters destroyed, forcing them to make do with whatever they had on hand to stay warm. In one case, during the construction of a temporary bridge to safely move a unit's motorized transportation, torrential downpour occurred, causing the river's water level to rapidly climb, threatening the supports. Tractors and trucks were actively crossing the bridge as this was occurring, and with little time to prevent disaster, men leapt into the freezing river to reinforce the threatened sections with cables and other material. In another case, when fording a shallow crossing, the current became so harsh that a vehicle tipped over and was thrown into the water. As one of the men in the cabin could not swim, a raft was quickly constructed by Major A. Bezgubenko after he had reached the shore, who used it to rescue Lance Corporal R. Romanazov. Many elements of the BAM's construction can in some regards be attributed to luck and happenstance. Anatoly Konstantovich writes, "In 66 days we walked 110 kilometers. We were very lucky, having covered 2/3 of the way, about 75 kilometers, when we met a group of geophysicists from the Leningrad Mining Institute. There were about 30 of them. They had already been studying the route of the future BAM for several months, describing soils, quarries, and water. Everything that interested us as well. We compared our data with their notes, and the reference points we had chosen coincided 99%. As a result, the Leningraders helped us finally determine where the military units could be placed and where the stations and quarries would be. It was in these very places that we later built." Those tasked with driving vehicles on the BAM had a heavy burden to bear. The roads established along the route were long, dangerous, and often reclaimed by nature without the knowledge of those who had previously carved them. In the summer, trucks were consumed by mud, and in winter they were buried in snowdrifts or ice. It was jokingly stated that these vehicles' engines did not run on fuel, but on the courage of those who dared to drive them. This was not entirely inaccurate either. For example, Senior Sergeant A. Gaidashev made 15 long-distance trips in 3 months, delivering cargo deep into the taiga. Each trip lasted 5 to 7 days, and there were many like him. To uphold the standards required by those who partook in this tremendous effort, training was conducted with extreme consistency, and safety standards were upheld whenever possible. The taiga was so treacherous that many soldiers spoke about the location as if they had landed on another planet. Commanders worked just as hard as their subordinates, planning ahead of the environment and maintaining an extreme degree of precision in all the work that was engaged. The exceedingly tight deadlines only made things worse. It is said that the taiga did not yield a single meter without a fight. When the railway troops finally broke through the taiga, to the point in which construction was to begin, many problems arose. There was a shortage of building materials, the intention of installing televisions and radios within each facility could not be engaged, as the units carrying those items were bogged down by the elements. And it wasn't until day 5 that subunits received so much as newspapers to confirm the outside world still existed. Many of these formations worked in complete isolation. I must emphasize that this was indeed a very dangerous occupation. In many cases, soldiers had to be rescued after becoming stranded. In one case, a column set out to deliver cargo to a point across the taiga. They were expected to return in 2 days. On the 3rd day, a distress signal was received, stating that the column had not arrived and its whereabouts were unknown. A helicopter could not be sent to retrieve them, as a blizzard was raging that prevented any aircraft from getting off the ground. This meant that somewhere out in the taiga, 9 men had to battle the elements until an unknown date, using only what they had brought with them. To make matters worse, the ice that dotted the road was beginning to crack, flooding the area with freezing water. Lance Corporal A. Seachef, who was leading the column in a high-mobility vehicle, drove along the bank where the water was shallowest. Private B. Mametov drove behind him. The front wheel of Mametov's vehicle fell into a crack. Lance Corporal Seachef grabbed a cable and jumped out of the cab. The water was up to his waist, but this did not stop him from attempting to rescue his friend. He hooked the cable to Mametov's truck and pulled it to safety. He had to tow the rest of the vehicle similarly. With heavy snow falling and visibility dropping to 0, it was far too dangerous to press on. This was a good decision, as beyond where they had stopped, an ice sheet and a sheer drop was present. They divided their 3-day emergency supply of food into 8 days, just in case. Some of the drivers grew despondent from hunger. A conversation that transpired around the men's campfire is remembered by those present throughout this event. Salas, Lance Corporal Sishev addressed Private Zelenkavicius. Have you read about the 4 brave sailors Zagoshin, Popovsky, and Krechkovsky? I have, he replied. 49 days in the ocean on a small barge without food or water. Great courage, those men. Could we do the same? I think we could. Take any one of us. Mametov, Sulemenkov, any of the others. They won't let you down. Isn't that right, guys? Right, the soldiers answered in unison. But deep down, each of them were scared the taiga may be their final resting place. 9 days they lasted before tractors broke through the tree line. Despite the state the soldiers were in, they could not make the return trip. There was not enough supplies to make it all the way back. It was shorter to continue along the previously established route. The front grew as civilian patronage organizations began to arrive from Ukraine and Moldova. They began constructing the Orgal and Olonka stations, which greatly aided the troops. On the 13th of June 1974, Komsomol members finally dumped the first cubic meters of earth into the roadside access from Tinda eastward. And on the 5th of February 1975, preparations had concluded and the railway troops drove the first spike of the main BAM line. This occurred 2,712 kilometers from Ustkut. The right to drive the spike was granted to Private Leonid Smirnov. Next to it, the builders placed a large granite cube, which became a monument commemorating the event. The original position chosen for the installation of this cube was problematic, as it had turned out to be a small bog. This bog was filled with material, but when summer came, the cube began to sink. A second position was prepared using sheet metal as a foundation. Eventually, it was moved in 1994. It was unintentionally destroyed by a Kato crane when it was being moved. With support of the construction troops, the railway troops began laying the BAM-Tinda line at a surprisingly rapid pace. This would connect the BAM to the Trans-Siberian main line. In 1975, the reconstruction of the Nizhneongarsk airfield began. This new airport would feature a 1,750-meter runway, and would be capable of servicing 80 passengers at any given time. In 1977, the airport was officially opened and saw 3 to 4 AN-24s each day in the summer months. Another airfield had to be refurbished alongside Nizhneongarsk, which was constructed in 1960 to provide AN-24 flights to Severodvaikalsk. After decades of neglect, it had been overtaken by nature. It was difficult to establish this second airport as it pulled personnel away from Nizhneongarsk. 4 AN-2s were stationed at the primary airfield. A small 600 by 60 meter site was allocated for them. They were to provide flights from Ulan-Ude to Angarakan, which was the location of the second airfield. AN-24s would arrive here, and AN-2s would carry them to their final destination. Angarakan was generally regarded as an unsafe airfield which barely met standards. As a result, only experienced AN-24 crews attempted to land there. Even minor precipitation caused the clay soil to soften, rendering the airfield inoperable. Large craters would form in the runway, which would take on significant amounts of water. These had to be emptied using buckets by the airport staff, and in some cases, passengers had to be mobilized to assist. The airport staff was 40 people who worked from morning until sunset for 3 summer seasons. Simultaneously, a small site was prepared on a mountain slope, and in 1975 it became a small airfield for AN-2 flights. These were conducted by crews based at the Bagdaran airport, who had extensive experience in mountainous terrain. Even before the opening of the airfield, crews managed to deliver fuel, food, equipment, and spare parts by landing on the ice of a small lake near the construction site. Many of these pilots carried out extremely difficult survey flights with the AN-2 in 1960 to plot the Uskut to Tinda route. In many cases, even subunit commanders arriving on the BAM seldom had time to settle in before they were expected to begin assisting the formation they were assigned to. Lieutenant Colonel Alexander Pavlovich recalls the following interaction. "Congratulations on your arrival to the BAM," said his brigade commander. "We'll get better acquainted later. For now, I'll briefly inform you of the tasks the battalion will have to carry out. Your Chief of Staff and Chief Engineer are already fully informed. The main task for today is the arrangement of the camp. Frosts will start in September, and you must be ready for them. I'm giving you a month for that. At the same time, it will be necessary to tackle production tasks. Building new bridges and culverts, rebuilding, completing, and repairing those bridges and culverts on the Irgal-Komsomolsk-on-Amur line that had been built by Gulag prisoners. You have no doubt heard that after the death of Stalin, the work on the BAM was halted. The camps were liquidated and most prisoners were amnestied. In the 20 years since 1953, many of the bridges and culverts, especially the wooden ones, became dilapidated and were destroyed. In addition, their poor structure has not aligned with current design standards, and the principle of bridge and culvert construction has changed. The battalion's main task for the winter will be the construction of a temporary combined railroad bridge across the Buya River. You must study the project documentation, familiarize yourself with the terrain, and begin developing the execution plan for its construction. Get the bridge drawings from the chief of the production department, Captain Anakin. He will assist you with his engineers. In the production department, there are officers who built bridges on the Ivdel-Ob and Tumen-Surgut lines, and on other northern projects. Use their experience. The bridge over the Buya is very important for the western direction of the BAM, toward Tinda. Such a bridge across a fast river can only be built in winter. The Buya is a treacherous river. In summer, 2 or 3 times a season, its water level will rise by 4 to 6 meters with masses of drifting logs, so prepare seriously. In a month, go on leave, so you'll be back by the frosts. Leave your chief of staff in charge. While you're on leave, Major Yurlov's mechanized battalion will build the subgrade to the bridge for the railway and the access road. Instruct the company commanders to prepare themselves seriously and to prepare the soldiers for the work, especially the new reinforcements. The conditions here are difficult. The battalion will soon be brought up to wartime strength. One of the primary issues encountered along the route was supplying the troops with drinking water. In autumn, tanker trucks had to haul this vital resource from long distances. This was impossible when winter set in, as the tanks would freeze with the liquid inside. As a result, ice was cut from the Tiger rivers, which was then transported to camps to be melted and drunk after antibacterial treatment. Surveys to locate significant deposits of groundwater were conducted to ease this burden in the warmer months. In some cases, 200-meter wells would be constructed for this purpose. With frontage expanding, communications became especially difficult. Radios were effective, but telephones were problematic, as wires laid across the terrain would often be destroyed by the unusually harsh elements present within the region, especially the frequent floods that occurred in spring. In many cases, it was actually easier to employ light utility helicopters as mail carriers to send written letters about each unit's situation. The administrative apparatus of the railway troops had to be expanded to support the scale of the operation. The branch's political department was transformed into a political directorate, and a special operations group was created within the main directorate of the railway troops to deal exclusively with BAM-related affairs. As tracks were being laid, luxuries such as dining halls, bakeries, clubs, and libraries began to appear in the camps of the railway troops. These were often constructed by volunteers who struggled against the elements. Lubricants often froze and metal turned brittle in the cold. To put things into perspective, the teeth of excavators would frequently shatter against the permafrost. Waterlogged roads and railway sections caused significant problems. The first year of BAM construction was marred by a peat bog swallowing an entire highway that had been constructed a few months prior. This was caused by the disruption of the moss covering these bogs, which was frozen and impossible to perceive throughout the winter. As the ground began to thaw, hundreds of cubic meters of soil disappeared in an instant. Lessons were learned, and eventually these issues no longer transpired. Despite the grueling conditions and inconsistent supplies, many units exceeded their quotas. A company, commanded by Senior Lieutenant A. Pyrozenko, located on one of the most difficult sections of the route, consistently achieved 120% of its monthly targets. Excavator operators often fulfilled double quotas per shift. This was achieved even in the hardest months, such as January, which brought especially tough soil. To motivate the troops, competitions were proposed by personnel of a bridge battalion, commanded by Captain L. Svetlov. They claimed they could fulfill their annual quota ahead of schedule, and put facilities into operation while achieving only good or excellent quality inspections. This motivated other units to pursue similar goals. Among those building the railway, the first place in the competition belonged to a subunit commanded by Senior Lieutenant V. Cosden. On the 1st of January, 1975, a camp was constructed near the Borja River. On the 2nd of January, the construction of the 622-meter bridge began. The first unit to begin work on this bridge was commanded by Komsomol member Sergeant A. Vikulov. The first pile took 4 days to drive and required nearly 2,000 strikes to bury it 20 centimeters into the ground. Fuel for the pile-driving units froze and steel bolts cracked from the temperature. A smithy and a sawmill were set up on the ice, eliminating the need to travel long distances for metal and timber. Many unit commanders stayed on the bridge for days at a time, while their subordinates traded out to recover from the elements. This inspired those working on the project to push themselves further and meet their quota. In February, the 28th Separate Railway Mechanized Battalion, to raise morale, produced a song. The song was first performed on the 23rd of February 1975, on Soviet Army and Navy Day. It was recorded onto a cassette and frequently played from loudspeakers while the unit worked. It was titled The Road of Dreams. On the 15th of April, a few days before the spring flood, the last span was laid. The construction effort required 10 icebreakers and the placement of about 60,000 cubic meters of rock. It took 3 months and some change to accomplish this task. This finally allowed cargo to be carried with ease to the forward section of the construction effort. Unfortunately, after the successful construction of this bridge, a rather hot summer followed, which melted snow atop the surrounding mountains. This resulted in a great deal of rain that caused water levels to rise significantly. These floodwaters submerged settlements and surveyor camps located along the bank. The river also worked to swallow the high icebreakers, cut the bridge off from its access points, and was successful in creating a massive jam of debris swept up in its current. By nightfall, the water level rose even higher. The gap between the lower part of the spans and the water was barely 40 centimeters. The bridge shuddered under the monstrous pressure, and could have collapsed into the river at any moment. The battalion tasked with working on the bridge was alerted of the impending disaster. The unit's commander announced that he was forming a detachment to save the bridge. It would be airlifted to the region and would only take volunteers, as the mission was exceedingly dangerous. Every man in the unit stepped forward in unison, and so only the strongest were selected, especially those that were confident swimmers. All night long, this detachment would work to push debris away from the bridge, illuminated only by searchlights from helicopters. They stood on the bridge's narrow supports with knowledge that if they fell in, it would be impossible to rescue them. When a jam began to appear near one of these supports, Lieutenant E. Supran climbed down onto the tangled mass of logs. He fastened ropes to the thickest trunks and with the assistance from his fellow soldiers pulled the logs out of the water and threw them over the bridge. For a full day, without rest or sleep, they fought to save the bridge. Many of the regiments that worked on this bridge were rapidly organized and deployed to the region with no official title or subordination. Many of these units operated companies that did not officially exist due to the speed in which they were mobilized. On May 9, 1975, the 180-kilometer Bam-Tinda line finally began to operate. The last section was granted to the winners of the competition I described earlier. The first train to traverse this route brought with it prefabricated houses, building materials, and much-needed equipment. The railway troops often set ambitious goals for themselves. It was believed that the Far Eastern Railway Ring could be completed in 1979, a year ahead of the previously established schedule. To close the ring from the north, it was necessary to link Urgal and Komsomolsk-on-Amur, a stretch of more than 500 kilometers. This route was problematic geographically speaking, and would push the railway troops to their limits in trying to meet these goals. There were dozens of large rivers, ridges, hills, and bogs. The track bed had to be built on narrow ledges along the riverbanks. Each bridge proved more complex than the last. And, to throw salt in the already gaping wound that was this undertaking, there was the Deuce-Allen Tunnel. An underground tunnel, 2 kilometers in length, which had to be driven through rock and permafrost before the Second World War. The tunnel was never put into operation. Over time, its drainage systems had fallen into disrepair. Inspection wells filled with debris, and over decades of abandonment, groundwater and Siberian frosts worked to erode the structure. Because water entered the tunnel's eastern axis and ran towards the western axis, upon freezing, large ice sheets would form, completely blocking the tunnel and all its auxiliary facilities. And when I say large ice sheets, I mean 32,000 cubic meters of ice. The railway troops were tasked with restoring this tunnel and bringing it back into operation. To begin work on clearing the tunnel, first a path to reach the structure needed to be constructed. The route's uniquely steep edges and huge rock formations made this difficult. It was decided to use explosives to remove these obstacles. This was no easy task, as demolition specialists had to work along slopes with grades of up to 60 degrees. Soldiers had to haul drilling rigs and explosives up 50-meter rock faces, after which they began to create deep boreholes. On one winter day, with temperatures around negative 40 degrees Celsius, the demolition team began preparing the explosives for application. This required placing a multi-ton explosive charge into the boreholes. The truck with the explosives was delayed by snowfall on an icy road. When it finally arrived, only a few hours of daylight remained, which was problematic as demolition was allowed only in daylight. The soldiers carried the explosives by hand up the icy slopes to the boreholes. It was faster and more reliable that way. Just before the sun had slipped below the horizon, the job was finished and the rocks were destroyed. Upon arrival at the tunnel, it instantly became clear that the previously established plan to destroy the ice sheet with pneumatic hammers would take far too long. About a year, to be exact. Engineers on the scene proposed a unique idea. Why not melt the ice? Experienced mining specialists from Khabarovsk were airlifted to the region to perform the necessary calculations, provide equipment, and put the idea into practice. Once summer had arrived, explosions were heard across the ridge. The ice barrier blocking the tunnel was destroyed, after which 2 powerful fans and 2 heat generators were set up. Through long, flexible ducts laid in a narrow slot under the tunnel, warm air was forced into its depths. This melted the upper layer of ice, while the lower layer was simultaneously destroyed through artificial means. Streams of water began to flow out of the tunnel, and on the very first day about 300 cubic meters of ice melted. It seemed the plan would be successful. However, it soon became clear that the ice was not melting throughout the entire tunnel. Somewhere inside, a huge block was completely plugging the corridor. A group of soldiers led by Junior Sergeant Marichenko were sent into the bowels of the tunnel, armed with pneumatic hammers. To reach the ice sheet's core, they had to crawl through a narrow passage, at times on all fours. The lack of oxygen and the oncoming streams of water made progress especially difficult. Finally, the culprit revealed itself. There was indeed a large mass of ice blocking the flow of air deeper into the tunnel. As the soldiers made contact with their hammers, a powerful jet of water burst through the opening and knocked the sergeant off his feet. This water had accumulated in the other half of the tunnel, and as the jam was removed, warm air filled the cavern. Day and night, motors roared and spotlights shone at the entrance of the Deuce-Allen Tunnel. As once snow began to fall, all of this work would be undone. A new drainage system was constructed to offset this concern, but with the already existing ice yet to be cleared, it was unlikely it could remain open. The quick thinking of the engineers who proposed this strategy allowed for the tunnel to be cleared 4 times faster than originally expected. After the ice was cleared, rails were laid through the tunnel in just 2 days. The first years of BAM construction resulted in a myriad of unique engineering solutions, especially when it came to bridge construction, which was an excellent means of training specialists and developing a doctrine for their practice to be put into place in wartime. Initially, 2 unique bridge designs were adopted as a result of the BAM, which became standard within the railway troops: pier and viaduct bridges, and bridges with supports made of blocks. Such blocks did not require the labor-intensive preliminary installation of formwork and greatly simplified the construction of piers. However, the foundations of these piers required a large volume of cast-in-place concrete, which was in some cases difficult to achieve. It was clear that the search would have to continue for the perfect bridge to be used across the BAM. In the unique permafrost conditions, the use of reinforced concrete piles proved highly effective, especially considering its reduced labor, as excavating deep pits in frozen soil was no longer needed. For this reason, it was adopted as the primary methodology moving forward. Even with this method, issues would still transpire when drilling boreholes. A rather famous example was an incident involving a rock stratum being encountered by the team excavating the area. A pointed steel rod was to be dropped into the hole to break up the rock and allow for the operation to continue. While this was being prepared, the cable supporting the projectile snapped, which resulted in the 1.5-ton object being jammed in the borehole. Work on the bridge halted as the hole began to fill with water. A power station operator named Akimov, realizing the issue could quickly escalate, volunteered to descend into the borehole and hook the rod to a new cable. After tying a rope around his waist, cable in hand, Akimov slipped into the darkness below. The hole was about 1 meter in diameter, with only a small dot of light visible overhead. Bracing his hands and feet against the walls, he methodically lowered himself deeper into the abyss. At the bottom, there was ice-cold water up to his waist. Feeling with his foot for the neck of the projectile, Akimov managed to tie the cable around it. He tugged on the rope, signaling those above to pull. The cable tightened and slipped from its constraints. With numb, frozen fingers, Akimov made one more attempt. The water was now up to his chest. Several times he would plunge into the icy water to secure the cable, and in the end he was finally successful and drilling could continue. The commander of Akimov's unit sent a letter to his parents in Volgograd. It read, "Thank you for raising such a son, a loyal comrade, a courageous soldier." The assault on the taiga, as it was described, garnered a reputation among those who served throughout this campaign. Before demobilization, soldiers would often joke that they accomplished 3 annual quotas in 2 years of work. In 1976, Komsomol conferences began, which were held by units on the BAM. They summed up the work of the last year and set new goals. In February 1977, the first rally of the railway troops took place in Khabarovsk, which was conducted with the intention of concluding the competitions I described earlier. The winners were as follows. Best commander of a bridge battalion was Major V. Bondarensky. Best company commander was Lieutenant A. Kuznetsov. Best track-laying operator was Lance Corporal V. Sheptalo, and outstanding excavator operator was Lance Corporal V. Snigur. As the construction effort pressed on deeper into the uninhabited east, it took sometimes weeks at a time to move as little as 100 meters. Mechanized equipment operators worked around the clock, often opting for overtime. It is stated in multiple secondary sources that bulldozer operators were some of the most efficient. Track-laying units were also working in what the soldiers described as shock mode, and generally advanced ahead of schedule. It is claimed that this productivity was the result of a letter that was circulated between various subunits, produced by a collection of young pioneers from Vyazemsky. Inside this letter, the children described that their troop was named after Konstantin Zaslanov, a legendary partisan who had worked at the Vyazemsky locomotive depot before the war. Together with the local Komsomol members, the pioneers had collected 100 tons of scrap for the BAM, and asked the railway troops to lay 1 kilometer of track in honor of Commander Zaslanov. This section was named the Zaslanov Kilometer. It was laid by the competition winners from the year prior. To improve command and control within the railway troops working on the project, in 1978 an office for BAM construction was created within the railway troops, who were tasked with resolving major logistical issues related to the BAM. On June 30th, 1979, 1 year ahead of schedule, the Far Eastern Railway was completed. The section was 500 kilometers in length. The first train was interestingly rowed by those who had won the aforementioned competition. Due to the increasing volume of civil construction projects along the BAM, and the absence of specialists within the railway troops to tackle these endeavors, in July 1980, the General Construction Trust, or GAL BAM Truststroy, was established, directly subordinate to the Chief of the Railway Troops. It was managed through the BAM Construction Directorate, which was subordinate to the Office for BAM Construction within the Central Directorate of Traffic Control of the Ministry of Railways. The contract formations were assigned segments, stations, and settlements to construct with no participation from the railway troops. They were fully independent. In early 1983, it was estimated that with the current pace of construction, it would be possible to complete the entirety of the Eastern BAM by '84. Troops adopted the slogan, "Early Junction Now," as the Military Council approved further work on the matter. This meant an additional 300 kilometers of taiga would need to be terraformed. This would involve the construction of 270 kilometers of railway, 177 bridges, and 15.4 million cubic meters of earthwork. The experience of those who had arrived in the taiga a decade before, as the eastern section began its construction, was used to significantly improve and expedite the following operation. A battalion arrived in February and began to establish living quarters for the troops. Log houses, a dining hall, a bakery, a club, and food storage facilities were established. The primary obstacle that lay ahead of this unit was the Ulagir Hill, which was for all intents and purposes a solid wall of rock. They would need to carve a 1.5-kilometer tunnel 18 meters below the surface. A mechanized laying battalion was chosen to cut the tunnel, as they had already carved many smaller tunnels prior to this assignment. They had also done many earthworks in difficult terrain, such as peat bogs. Alongside removing 300,000 cubic meters of ice, they would also need to use 4 tons of explosives to form the passage. Akin to the race to Berlin, all of the subunits deployed on the BAM were competing to drive the last spike. When the final 12 kilometers were reached, a golden panel was manufactured in Przewalsk. With the final section manufactured, the railway troops were unusually inspired and managed to lay 700 meters each day. Senior Lieutenant Korolenko's team would install it. This golden panel was given the serial number 55280. On the 16th of April 1984, the section was finally completed.
Они прожили здесь трудную, суровую жизнь. Они прожили здесь прекрасную жизнь. Они достигли того, о чем мечтали. И память о созданном останется на века.
Шли сквозь годы и ветры, мы с утра до темна, к этим нескольким метрам золотого звена. Шли и трудно, и гордо, но настал этот день. Было в слове стыковка, эхо звездных путей.
Unfortunately, despite these achievements, the BAM would claim a life shortly thereafter. Torrential downpour flooded many of the surrounding rivers. These floodwaters tore through the taiga, taking trees, boulders, and other large objects with them. Small bridges were washed away, and so pontoon bridges were erected to provide access to regions that were in desperate need of supplies. One night, a platoon manning one of these bridges experienced an issue. The rain had increased to new heights, dragging a great deal of debris against the pontoon, threatening to collapse it. Oleg Apentinok advanced towards the water's edge carrying an axe. Upon breaking apart the mast, it appeared that the unit's troubles were behind them. At that moment, a large tree emerged from the depths below the pontoon, destabilizing it and throwing him into the raging current. For his actions, he would posthumously be awarded the Order of the Red Star. Upon the conclusion of the operation, the railway troops had completed more than 220 million cubic meters of earthworks, 1,217 structures, 45 large and 296 medium bridges, and 527 communication lines. 30 stations were constructed to service the railway, alongside a combined 174,000 square meters of housing. Additionally, 8 schools, 13 kindergartens, and a myriad of additional facilities were erected. 50% of the railway troops were involved at any given time with the BAM's construction. I cannot overstate the role that helicopters played throughout the construction of the BAM. Without their assistance, the project would have been impossible. The primary models present were Mi-6, Mi-10K, Mi-4, Mi-8, Mi-1, and Ka-26. Mi-2 played a minor role but was still present. Helicopters were used throughout the construction of major industrial facilities, transportation routes, power lines, and pipelines. They were also used to transport important passengers, cargo, and mail. Emergency medical assistance, rescue operations, protection of forests from fires, and the relocation of light utility vehicles were among their secondary roles. Some soldiers who brought their families with them to build the BAM stayed as long as 11 years. Those who served in the railway troops generally recall a warm and friendly atmosphere amongst their units despite the brutal conditions. They also describe the mix of nationalities working on the project as especially interesting and rather unique. Many have noted in memoirs that at that time and even today they did not view their actions as heroic or especially important. Some remember the event as if they had fought an especially brutal war, which in many regards they had. A rather fitting quote reads as follows: "Generally, I remember the BAM as an unplanned and very difficult, literally military stage of my life. A stage very remarkable, extraordinarily memorable, but one of which, as with any war, you can say, there was a lot that was interesting, very little that was good." Yes, there was a lot that was interesting. Untouched places, virgin nature, unusual conditions, the scale of the construction and the relations among people, so on and so on. As for the bad, there was plenty of that as well. Although, thank God, much of it has already faded from memory. It has this wonderful property. And thus, the good seems to have become more. Nevertheless, when I think of the good and significant things that happened in my life, I do not recall the BAM first of all. Everything I accomplished and everything I achieved in life, whether much or little, not for me to judge, all of it happened either before or after those 2 BAM years. And yet, there was a lot that was interesting. Some men called to work on the BAM had already completed their 2 years of compulsory military service. These people generally view the experience in a worse light than those who had just entered the military. A shocking number of those who served on the BAM sent referrals to be transferred to the region to assist in the ongoing effort. This was partially prompted by the constant news coverage of the event, which was likely done to stir excitement within the population in search of volunteers. Most of those who partook in these events noted that having to travel across the country, sometimes experiencing 7 time zones in a single trip, motivated them, as it made the importance of rail transit within the USSR clear. Sometimes individuals, while actively working on the railway, would be picked up by a helicopter without a chance to change into formal attire, arrive at a nearby headquarters, receive a medal, and then immediately be dropped off where they had been collected to continue working. The experience with political officers on the BAM varied based on their position. Deputy political officers at the company level often spent months on the line working with soldiers and were well-liked, as they often took jobs, never assigned to them in the first place, to relieve their subordinates. Though higher-level officers did not share the same enthusiasm, and were usually looked on with a bit more disdain. Generally speaking, those who arrived on the BAM early were most fond of their efforts and experience, while those that arrived later viewed the situation differently. Of course, it also depended on the battalion these men served in, as the quality of each formation was generally determined by the competence of its commander. According to many, disposing of unused materials and trash was considered one of the more difficult actions. Interestingly, some units had imported Western equipment instead of Soviet systems. One BAM worker recalls the presence of Kato excavators, Komatsu bulldozers alongside D8K and TD25. Usually these were used by civilian specialists, but in some cases they were employed by the railway troops. Some foreign systems made their way into military units, as an issue encountered when engaging earthwork was the outdated, worn-out dump truck fleet, unsuited to the harsh climate. Re-equipment with imported dump trucks, bulldozers, and cranes was met with enthusiasm in mechanized battalions. It is emphasized in each memoir and interview that the environment was completely impassable, and Natali Pisarev recalls the following: "The uniqueness of the main line in terms of the concentration of difficulties seemingly deliberately created by nature in these places is beyond dispute. Characterizing the climate and geological conditions of the BAM construction areas, even the most restrained authors are compelled to use the most extreme degrees of emotional evaluation. The frosts are brutal, the insects merciless, the permafrost treacherous, and the rivers turbulent. The seismicity destructive. And all of this is true. Such is the BAM. Practically everywhere along the route, with the exception of small islands, permafrost reigns, with a depth from 1 to 3 meters to hundreds of meters in some areas. Over the entire length of the line, the terrain is heavily waterlogged. These are the notorious bogs, through which in the warm season you can neither walk nor drive. If one adds to this quarry collapses, landslides, screes, ice accumulations, permafrost-related processions, mud flows, tectonic activity, and seismicity around 7 to 9 points, then the irony of the BAM builders becomes clear when they answer journalist questions, who would often ask whether the mosquitoes interfered with construction. Additional phrases I did not mention above that were born from those working on the line were today a record, tomorrow the norm. We are building the BAM for centuries. We are building the BAM is building us. Give us 1 million cubic meters and give us the golden link. Recruits arriving from military academies when certain positions opened would be tested into certain roles. A common joke among those arriving from these universities was an engineer can become a political officer, but a political officer cannot always become an engineer. Before an officer was posted to the BAM, there were many qualifications that had to be considered. Aptitude in long-distance running and swimming were usually at the top of this list, alongside a low number of disciplinary violations. Interestingly, in the years before the BAM, factors such as high blood pressure could exclude one for service within combat arms. This meant they would be sent to a rear service like the railway troops. So a lot of the older veterans on the BAM were not physically fit for it, and yet they made do. Small isolated battalions existed alongside brigades who generally had a much harder time surviving in the taiga without the support of a larger formation. One such unit was the 97th Railway Track Battalion. Vladimir Sishoboyanev stated, "In these garrisons, a great deal depended on the rhythmic and uninterrupted supply of water, electricity, and heat. Not only the volume of training and practical work performed, but the very life of the service members and their families. It was necessary using our own resources to build boiler houses of the required capacity, lay dozens of kilometers of heating mains, install power line poles and the power supply nodes of mobile power plants. All of these concerns lay on the shoulders of the mobile repair workshop platoons. Delays in fuel delivery and other resources could prove deadly in winter, where a night without heat was usually fatal. In some cases, temperatures could drop as low as -60 degrees Celsius and even -70. Railway troops arriving from warmer SSRs were startled by these temperatures. Those arriving from Ukraine at the outset of the construction described these conditions as frightening." Sergei Antonov made the following comments on the weather and relationships he formed on the BAM. "Despite the fact I am a Far Easterner, the local weather of course surprised me. We arrived at the battalion in the beginning of June. At this time, the larch was just beginning to leaf out. Already in mid-August, everything suddenly turned yellow. Snow did not keep us waiting long, it fell already in September. Of course, if the stove was heated around the clock, then in the tents it was quite tolerable. We often saw mountain rams on the snow-covered hills. We lived with 40 people together. Officers, like us, lived in trailers. Among my fellow servicemen, there were many natives of the eastern republics. Work on the main line left no one in the country indifferent. The construction was perceived as something exotic. While the soldiers worked, they were often joined by the Magistral Ensemble and the Alenyanka Vocal Ensemble, who would deliver live performances. The most popular songs were Kilometers, Taiga Romance, BAM That's You, which is likely a version of Road of Dreams, The Unconquered, and Song About the Brigade. Cassettes containing these songs were given as commemorative gifts to soldiers and officers upon being transferred to new postings along the route.
Приходят дни без писем, бывает нам не сладко, вдруг в памяти всплывет отринутый уют. Грусти, грусти со мной, озябшая палатка, послушай, что сегодня друзья твои поют. Грусти, грусти со мной, озябшая палатка, Послушай, что сегодня друзья твои поют. За сопками крутыми, за вечной мерзлотою есть каменные стены, асфальт и паркет. Пройдешь до магазина с веселою толпою, пройдешь и не заметишь свой выстраданный след. Пройдешь до магазина с веселою толпою, пройдешь и не заметишь свой выстраданный след. Там нет костров высоких, из бревен нет дорожек, ни волчьих глаз за елкой, ни радуги зимой. Но есть чего на свете не сыщешь ты дороже, любимый и надежный мой человек родной. Но есть чего на свете не сыщешь ты дороже, любимый и надежный мой человек родной. Сметайте же морозы мою слезу краткой, любовью обогретый я плавлю вечный лед. Грусти, грусти со мной, озябшая палатка, послушай, не несет ли письма мне вертолет? И все-таки грустит озябшая палатка, послушай, не несет ли письма мне вертолет?
Коснулась, вдаль зовет комсомольская юность. Где-то ждут вдалеке нас рассветы, ждут те песни, что не спеты. Пусть холодные ветры там свищут, знай, мы легкого счастья не ищем. Пусть метели шумят, злятся вьюги, мы уверены друг в друге. Но споют колеса нам, попутчики всем ветрам, и уходит в тревожную даль наша магистраль. Но поют колеса нам, мы попутчики всем ветрам, и уходит в тревожную даль наша магистраль. А романтика дело простое, а романтика дело такое, чтобы сердце себя не щадило, чтобы сердце смелым было. Нам откроются трудные дали, мы не зря в этом клятву давали, и мечта, что вела за собою, перестанет быть мечтою. Но споют колеса нам, мы попутчики всем ветрам, Ты моя судьба, ты моя любовь, с детских лет ты сердцу дорог. Все, чем я живу, связано с тобой, с именем твоим мой город. Прямые проспекты и башни старинные — это Москва. И громады высотных домов и не глинная — это Москва. И звезды салюта над площадью Красною — это Москва, это Москва. Все мы похожие, чем-то и разные — это Москва. Я еще найду лучшие слова для тебя, моя столица. Мне в любом краю радостна Москва, знать, что я твоя частица. Прямые проспекты и башни старинные — это Москва. Громады высотных домов и не глинная — это Москва. И звезды салюта над площадью Красною — это Москва. Это Москва. Все мы похожие, чем-то и разные — это Москва. Проспекты и башни старинные — это Москва. Громады высотных домов и не длинная — это Москва. И звезды салюта над площадью Красною — это Москва, это Москва. Все мы похожие, чем-то и разные — это Москва.
Most of those present on the BAM subordinate to the railway troops were conscripts, but some who served in the branch elected to be posted in the region. These were specialists offered positions upon receiving a military education. Specialists usually had better living standards than conscripted men. Victor Tanash recalls the following. I worked on the BAM from 1977 to 1983. Specialists were invited there willingly. By that time, I had received 2 educations in the transport field. The BAM offered good prospects. I learned the exact address of my new housing even before arriving on site. It was not even a dormitory, but an apartment, although I did not have much time to spend there. From morning till evening we worked, we built. Along with me in 1977, 9 more young specialists arrived by assignment. 4 married couples and 1 bachelor. He, too, soon got married. Families were created quickly on the BAM. People met and made friends, dated, built new roads and families. The conditions, of course, could not be called comfortable. Thus, living in a dormitory, a newly formed family might receive a modest corner separated from the rest only by a curtain. During my time on the construction project, I worked in several specialties. One of them was personal administration. Once I had the opportunity to be in Moscow together with the first detachment of young railway operation specialists from across the Union. On November 5th, 1979, I returned with new personnel to the BAM to Tinda. Of course, people from the west were struck by the climate, bitter, cold, piercing wind, and they were in thin coats. Fur coats and sheepskins were not a luxury, but a necessity, and they would soon be given out to every individual. But soon after everyone was settled into 9-story dormitories, work boiled up and surged with renewed vigor. In some cases, children were born on the BAM as many families were present for its construction. One such event is remembered by Cherkasov Alexeyevich. That night, I was awoken by a phone call. The deputy officer at brigade headquarters calmly reported that a woman had gone into labor. I looked at the clock. It was between 3 and 4 in the morning. Still not fully awake and not really understanding what was going on, I asked why the duty officer was calling me. It seemed as if the officer was surprised. Who else should he call? It turned out that hundreds of kilometers from a maternity hospital, a woman had gone into labor, and there was no special transport or time left to get her help. I asked the duty officer to contact the duty officer of the Corps and request permission from the district headquarters for a medical helicopter flight. Painful minutes of waiting for a decision at district level dragged on. A few minutes later, the duty officer reported that the district had not authorized the helicopter due to weather conditions. We continued looking for a solution together with the duty officer, but it turned out that many people were already up and looking for suitable transport. Today, I can no longer recall the surname of the brigade duty officer. I know that he was a lieutenant colonel. He said that a freight train would be pulling into the station. If they uncoupled the diesel locomotive and used it as an ambulance, that would be the optimal solution, especially since they had already reported that the woman's water had broken. That is what they did. A few minutes later, the duty officer reported that the woman in labor had been laid in the locomotive, insulated, and was accompanied by a nurse, who had administered appropriate injections to delay the birth. Meanwhile, they informed us that a special ambulance vehicle was already driving to meet the locomotive. Dawn was approaching and I began getting ready for work, when the duty officer called again with good news. The locomotive and the ambulance had met at the crossing, and the woman had been taken by a medical team. The vehicle was returning. I felt the weight lift from my soul. The woman was now in reliable hands. At headquarters, I continued preparing for the meeting of party activists. It was demanding, painstaking work, and for a time I forgot about the night's incident. Just before I went on stage to open the party activist meeting, the phone rang backstage. The duty officer at the brigade headquarters, in a deliberately crisp, somewhat wary military tone, reported, "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, a boy has been born." I stepped up to the lectern, and my first words were about the duty officer's report. Many officers in the hall knew about the nighttime saga and had helped to resolve the situation. Loud applause broke out. Someone suggested naming the boy after the officer. Someone else suggested celebrating. The happy news was discussed in the hall for a long time, and I stood and waited because the brigade's personnel were celebrating another victory. It is stated that hazing was extremely rare on the BAM due to the frequency of official competitions between troops. I will conclude this section with a humorous story from Pavel Korolev because I think it's important to include it. And one more amusing situation. I am returning from the route home in a club vehicle, Pack 60. We left early in the morning. After 2 to 3 hours on the road, I noticed that the driver was fighting sleep. I made the decision to pull to the right, go into the shoulder, and get some sleep. Both the driver and I fell asleep. After some time, I woke up to find that the vehicle was standing still but rocking. The driver was still asleep. To my astonishment, I saw in the rear view mirror a huge bear standing on its hind legs, rocking the vehicle's body, apparently enjoying the creaking of the springs. I woke the driver and quietly explained the situation. The driver started the engine. To our great fortune, the engine proved obedient, and we hastened away from the stop, leaving behind a dissatisfied Mikhail Putovich. The BAM was used as a constant means to refine and train the railway troops both technologically and organizationally. The need for mechanization was discovered and implemented, and interestingly, many exercises took place on the BAM, with the intention of training units to combat saboteurs in wartime. I will show some photos quickly to demonstrate what this looked like, but there really isn't any information on them. Some of the organizational changes implemented while the BAM was in construction are as follows. The integration of technical platoons into each company within a battalion, which work to assist the technical companies already present at higher levels. This allowed for the creation of an echelon maintenance system. Before the BAM, units were supplied with food through depots at the front and army level. There was no native food supply within railway brigades. In situations where the railway troops were doing very little work and the operational tempo was very low, this was sufficient, but it was quickly understood that this could not support the railway troops if they were consistently on the move. To combat this, a new food supply system was created, which involved the front supplying the brigade, which was skipped beforehand, who would create a reserve used to supply separate units at lower levels. This food would move a maximum of 300 kilometers, but often stayed within 150 kilometers of the front. The BAM also demonstrated the importance of equipping units with facilities to clean themselves and launder their clothes, as there were a few cases where lice outbreaks would happen due to the remoteness of the region and the inability to easily access bathing material. These reforms to the rear of the railway troops allowed them to live relatively well while deployed on the BAM. In total, these structures to support the branch included 231 barracks, 78 dining halls with 500 seats each, 83 headquarters, 54 medical posts with 8 to 10 beds each, 29 infirmaries, 32 bakeries, 13 vegetable stores with a capacity of 12,400 tons, 64 ice houses, 64 bathhouses, 57 laundries, 82 food stores, and 85 clothing depots, 69 boilers, 59 fuel and lubricant depots, with a capacity of 29,000 tons, managed by the pipeline troops, which I discussed in my video on the matter. Though some soldiers remember things differently, they recall living in field conditions for much of the time, considering they were constantly on the move, working day and night. Supposedly permanent structures did not appear until a decade after construction had began. While on the line, soldiers lived in tents and trailers, and did not see these assets. Each garrison had temporary clubs seating 250 to 500 people. Each unit organized farms to produce fresh meat and produce, as it was hard to deliver these foods when compared to procuring them on site. Up to 70 tons of meat were obtained per year from these investments. Military townships for the families of the workers were provided with modern conveniences like central heating and hot and cold water. Due to the extreme altitude in 1975, oxygen bottle filling stations using the AKDS-70 oxygen production units were organized to assist with the altitude. Up to 30% of medium repairs and 80% of small repairs of equipment were performed directly on site by mobile repair teams from repair battalions, using mobile shops. 50 to 70% of major repairs and 100% of medium repairs transpired at facilities organic to each garrison. Around 150 road construction systems and up to 120 automobiles of various types had to be sent to higher facilities each year for more intensive repairs. One of the technologies that was unfortunately not employed on the BAM were floating rail bridges, which could be used to rapidly deploy crossings in Europe. These proved too difficult to get anywhere near the BAM, as the remote conditions and their temporary nature would have created more problems than they solved. To reduce energy consumption on the BAM, which was in some cases 10 to 15 times greater than what was expected in the Russian SSR, universities, both military and civilian, from across the Soviet Union worked to develop advanced weatherproofing systems to normalize consumption in the newly established settlements. Lev Terekov, who partook in this project, noted that the energy saved between each region of the BAM monetarily accounted for the price of what he described as 20 excellent foreign cars.
Ну, в беседе с ребятами, ребята сейчас нас говорят по концу стройки, по истечению всего срока строительства этого БАМа. Возможно, многие желают, да, и, видимо, они это сделают, конечно. Проехать по всей этой трассе, поглядеть вот на самом деле из окна свой участок дороги, поглядеть, посмотреть, в общем, где своими руками строил этот БАМ, строил эти тяжелые километры. Конечно, это будет очень здорово. Ну, в общем-то, это помыслы всех ребят, всей нашей бригады. Ну, я, собственно, сам тоже присоединяюсь к ним, конечно. Это все здорово. Все это будет на самом деле все интересно в жизни вспомнить. Вот именно все это вкладывается на эти километры нашей стройки сейчас. Ну вот и все. Пора нам приниматься новый километр, ребята.
Байкало-Амурская магистраль. Солнце в небе светит мудро, молодеет древний край. От Байкала до Амура мы проложим магистраль. Встретим зябкие рассветы, встретим долгую бурду, биографию планеты впишем мы свою страну. Слышишь, время гудит там, на просторах крутых, там небольшая тайга покоряется нам. Слышишь, время гудит там, на просторах крутых, там. Это колокол наших сердец молодых. Слышишь, время гудит там, на просторах крутых, там. Небольшая тайга покоряется нам. Слышишь, время гудит там, на просторах крутых, там. Это колокол наших сердец молодых. Будет нам порою трудно, но земле любимой в дар лягут рельсы, будто струны наших песенных гитар. Солнце в небе светит мудро, молодеет древний край. От Байкала до Амура мы проложим магистраль. Слышишь, время гудит там, на просторах крутых, там. Небольшая тайга покоряется нам. Слышишь, время гудит там, на просторах крутых, там. Это колокол наших сердец молодых. Слышишь, время гудит там, на просторах крутых, там. Небольшая тайга покоряется нам. Слышишь, время гудит там, на просторах крутых, там. Это колокол наших сердец молодых. Байкало